Dr. Xiaoxin from the Rich Institute and the University of San Francisco. Unfortunately, Dr. Wu was taken ill, so we will have a Skype presentation instead, and I believe that he is now thoroughly seated. And without further ado, I will give the floor to Dr. Wu, so please.
Sorry, who is the speaker?
This is Dr. Xiaoxin Wu from the Rich Institute at the University of San Francisco.
Okay, I think we're in business. Can everybody hear me well?
Yes.
Okay. All right, and now on your screen, and Joseph, and make sure that my big head doesn't show. It's just a black screen.
Yes, you're a very small head right now, so you're okay.
Okay, give me a second. Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you, Dr. Ho, for your kind invitation. And also, I want to take this opportunity to thank the co-sponsor of this symposium, the UM Asia Library, the UM Department of History, and Eisenberg Institute for Historical Studies. And special thanks to the conference organizers, Dr. Joseph Ho and Professor Cassell, I hope I pronounced her name correctly, and who kindly invited me to share my research and experience at this particular meeting. Moreover, I want to congratulate the alumni of the Shanghai American School for their dedication of more than a decade, more than a century-long friendship between Chinese and American people through education. It is indeed a legacy to celebrate. I'd also like to apologize for not being able to come to the symposium, and I was very much looking forward to attending, but some sort of bug infected me during my most recent trip to Shanghai a week ago. In a way, this may be an excuse. After all, this is Shanghai, a common link, SAS, and my story today here. And I also want to make a disclaimer, and I've been working at the University of San Francisco since 1989, and I'm not a Jesuit, and I'm not a priest. I'm just what I call a stupid scholar. So, just want to make it clear. Speaking of Shanghai, and this picture represents the time the city that many of us have not been to, and certainly not me, because it was taken in the 1930s. I was too young then. But this picture must remind most of us who have been there recently. A picture is worth 1,000 words indeed. It tells how much the city has changed. My presentation today is entitled Legacies of the History and Endeavors Today. I will first examine briefly the historical presence and experience of the members of the Society of Jesus, the Jesuits, in Shanghai from the mid-1850s to the 1950s. Then I will introduce some of the works of the Rich Institute at the University of San Francisco. And founded in 1984, the Rich Institute is a Jesuit research center for Chinese Western cultural history. I will end with a story relating to both of the above sections that has caught international attention in the past decade without any definite outcome, and a consequence that many of us have become familiar with under the complex social, political, cultural, and even religious environment in China today. I want to pause for a second. How am I doing? Is it okay from your end? Please? Okay, I need to hear something just to make sure. Okay, on we go. And Jesuits first entered China in the mid-16th century with what George Dunn has referred to as a generation of giants. Matteo Ricci, Ferdinand Verbiest, and Johann Adamsfeld Longueville, among many names that many of us are so familiar with. The early Jesuit movement to China was interrupted by the suppression of the Society of Jesus in 1773. After the restoration of the Society of Jesus in 1841, in 1814, after the restoration of the Society of Jesus in 1814, in 1842, 3 Jesuits, Father Claude Gottland, Francois Esquet, and Benjamin Prouvaire, returned to China and started the Shanghai Mission. They started the mission in the suburbs of Shanghai, Zigaway. And one of the first things they did, of course, was to build a church. David Mangello, in his 2015 publication, The Catholic Invasion of China, points out that one of the most important Catholic education and publication hubs in China was found in Zigaway, the headquarters of the French Jesuit mission on the outskirts of Shanghai. By the early 20th century, an impressive missionary and scholarly complex had been constructed in Zigaway, including St. Ignatius College, a school of theology, an orphanage with workshops, a research library, a residence complex, a mid-sized church complex, and an astronomical observatory, among many other constructions. The entire Catholic community of Zigaway in Shanghai numbered some 3,500 people by 1916. Of course, we should not forget Mr. Ma Xiangbo, and a Chinese Jesuit, who founded the Aurora University in 1903. Now the university is called the Fudan University. Moreover, between 1906 and 1910, a new cathedral was built. It is named St. Ignatius Cathedral, the grandest church in the Far East, as noted at that time. And please keep these 2 pictures in your mind, because I'm going to come back later in my presentation. But what the Jesuits did in Zigaway, perhaps the following clips from the film Ageless China, made in 1947, will tell us some more. And please watch.
Now in one little jump from the old imperial splendors of Peking to the modern Shanghai, where a Mexico sign looming up in front of the camera highlights the grandeur of Peking and the drabness of Shanghai, great city that is a hotspot for American and Chinese influence. In the canals in and around Shanghai, the tribes of people are born, live, and die on these canals. They are a race apart, these both people, with their own diet, a sort of gypsy food. Children playing outside the compound wall at Zigaway. And here is the old capital of this famous mission center, one of the largest and greatest mission centers in the whole world. It stands upon the site of the old home of Du Quan Ji, one of the father of Jesus' early converts, who in 1610 law in the empire corresponding to both the prime minister. His ancient home is today a Jesuit mission center, with schools, orphanages, a major and minor seminary, a famous observatory, a house of theology, and a great church of cathedral proportions. Two orphan boys, now grown up, both deaf mute, have learned the sign language in the orphanage. The Jesuit brothers, who for many, directed the boys' orphanage and two St. Mary's, Nicholas. The orphanage where boys become expert craftsmen, artists, painters, sculptors, wood carvers, goldsmiths, and silversmith workers. And where they learn trades as well, knitting, shoemaking, carpentry. This is all some of their work. Here are little deaf-mute orphan girls learning the sign language. One feels the vibrations in the throat of another, learning to form sound. That is a Chinese counter of the Holy Soul, teaching her wards the sign language. Notice how she adopts her gestures with lively facial expressions. You can almost tell what she's saying by the expressions on her face. Again, among the reclamation. These craftsmen and artists were most abandoned babies, picked up in the Shanghai by fair Christian women organized for this relief, brought into the orphanage, cared for by the helpers. Then at a certain age, boys turned over to the boys' orphanage run by the Jesuits. The girls, the girls' orphanage was run by the nuns. Here is a mark for the Blessed Carmen of the Blessed Mother of China. There in the center is the Blessed Mother and her infant son, and around the sides there are carvings of all the famous cathedrals in the world. At the top, sitting Peter in Rome. All of this is marvelous that compares with the best wood carving on anywhere in the world. Is the work of the orphan boys here displaying their handiwork. When we see those tiny carvings are given aloud, we understand better the great architectural treasures. Here is another carving by the orphan artist. The panel depicts from one of the old many historical maps. Unfortunately, we cannot bring out the intricacies of this delicate woodwork. Where is the merit to duplicate this fine?
Give me a second. Now, here is another photo of the Jesuit community in Shanghai taken in the mid-1930s. And by 1949, there were 232 Jesuits working in Shanghai, with the largest concentration in Shanghai. This is a photo of the last ordination of young Jesuits at Shanghai, 1951. In other words, Shanghai was really one of the largest cultural and educational centers between East and West in China through decades of work by the Jesuits, personnel of other religious orders, and the local Chinese. Of course, we all know what happened in the 1950s in Shanghai. Many Chinese novices were sent to the Philippines. For those Chinese priests who stayed behind, they were arrested with their bishop, tried for their counter-revolutionary activities, and spent the next 2 decades in prison. For the Jesuits from foreign countries, many were arrested and put under house arrest. Eventually, they were all expelled. The connection between China and the Jesuits seemed to have been cut off again by the next 40 years. But not so. One of the members of the Jesuit mission to China during this period is Father Francis Rouleau. He was sent to China in 1929. By the 1940s, he was a professor and a professor of church history in the seminary in Zigaway. His love for China never diminished in spite of the fact he was expelled from China in 1952 after more than 20 years of service in the country. He continued his research on the Jesuit mission history in China, especially on the Chinese rights controversy, and mentored the next generation of Jesuits in California who were preparing to devote themselves to China. His special archival collection of more than 55,000 folios of historical documents and research notes on the Chinese rights controversy have been used since he passed away in 1984 by scholars. Here is a voice recording of Father Francis Rouleau made a year before he passed away in 1984. He talked about his love of China, his teaching experience in Shanghai, and his dedication to the Society of Jesus. It is because it was made about 30 years ago, and the voice is not that clear, but I think it would be interesting for us to hear a real voice of a Jesuit who has given his life to China.
One of the greatest questions that our Lord took in my life has been to stand in China and to keep. That was the power of Christ. And the day before I was like to die gospel. One of the things that's come the most of my experience in China was a greater appreciation of love for the Society of Jesus. And that came about because my work was with Jesuits. I was a Jesuit. I was in courses of different nationality. German, French, Italian, all and cultural interchange. A cross-section, a cross-card of the whole society, to be with them, to live with them, and to teach them, and to hear them, and to know their ideas. But one of the greatest experiences of my life.
One of the younger Jesuits he mentored was Father Edward Malatesta. He was born in New Jersey in an Italian immigrant family, and Father Ed Malatesta made up his mind to become a missionary to China at a very young age. Although circumstances did not allow him to do so, he later on became a biblical scholar specializing in John's. When the relationship between China and the United States became normalized in 1979, he started learning Chinese at the age of 45. And then established the Reach Institute at the University of San Francisco. The mission of this institute is to promote cross-cultural exchange between China and the West through education and research, particularly in the area of Christianity in China. And Father Albert Chen, another Jesuit trained in Harvard as a Ming historian, joined the Reach Institute in 1985, and moved his lifelong collection of more than 65,000 volumes of Chinese books in history, philosophy, religion, art, and literature, and many other subjects from Hong Kong to San Francisco, forming the core of the current library of the Rich Institute. Thus, the historical legacy of the relationship between China and the Jesuits continues despite of obstacles and difficulties. The difference is that the continuation of such an endeavor has taken up a different form under the new situation. So what does the Rich Institute do? Here's a few examples. And first, preserving history. The Rich Institute does so by intentionally collecting, cataloging, and whenever possible, digitizing archival materials in the area that we specialize in. And for example, these are the 4 portraits from WWII orphanage. And this is a rubbing of an early Catholic tombstone where the image of a Madonna is first featured visually in China. And this is an imperial edict of the 55th year of the Kangxi reign relating to the Chinese rights controversy. And this is a wood carving of an artwork by the orphans and Tushanwan orphanage in WWII. Currently, the Rich Institute has, among many others, a library holding more than 85,000 volumes of specialized books, more than 400,000 photos of digital archival images, and more than 15,000 images concerning Christianity in China. And secondly, we produce publications. In the past 20 years, the Rich Institute has produced more than 200 titles of books on the study of Christianity in China, and primarily in English, Chinese, and French. Some of the books are about the collections in China or published with colleagues in China include the following. For example, in the 1980s, and the Rich Institute was part of the initiative of San Francisco Shanghai Sister City. And under its auspices, under its kind of administration, we published a catalog of rare books with the Municipal Library of Shanghai. And we also published a book in the early 21st century, a catalog of books concerning the publications of church publications in Shanghai. And this is a CD version of a complete run of a journal, a Women's Messenger, published by a Protestant missionary organization. And also in the first decade of the 21st century, we worked with the Shanghai People's Publishing House and produced a series of publications on New Century, New Scholars, and New Thoughts. And we also offer scholarships, and it's called Malatesta Scholarship in memory of Father Ed Malatesta. And scholars who have benefited from this particular scholarship are all Chinese doctoral students in intellectual history, literature, and art, and education, linguistics, sociology, and biographical studies, and of course, I know that I'm running out of time, but I do want to tell you a story and concerning this scholarship. That will be the last section of my presentation. Now, in the remember this church and the WWII Cathedral, and now, and of course, it is kind of standing among all the high scrapers, and inside it is still as beautiful as has always been, but there is one problem. And during the Cultural Revolution, the particular kind of artifacts in the church, namely the stained glass windows, were all smashed. And so nothing was left as a result of the Cultural Revolution. Now, in the late 1990s, the Bishop of Shanghai sent 2 women Chinese women artists to the Philippines, to Italy, to the United States to learn Western art and church art and get themselves familiarized with basically biblical art. In 1999, we gave both of them the first Malatesta scholarship to come to the University of San Francisco to learn how to make stained glass objects. And that is to be a very kind of a profitable investment, so to speak. And at the beginning of the 21st century, one of the women artists returned to China, and the bishop immediately assigned her the job to replace entire stained glass, or not replace, and to put newly designed stained glass windows in the entire church itself. But instead of a reproduction of the end of the 19th and early 20th century Spanish and French church art styles, the bishop specifically asked the artist to produce the new stained glass with new thoughts that would address the local Chinese Catholic community in a Chinese art language that could be understood and felt closely in the 21st century. And then, by working with an American Jesuit artist and a number of young Chinese sisters, the woman artist devoted his entire life in the following decade to this project. From a computer design to life-size modeling and to glass cutting and to group assembling and to the final complete layout of a stained glass window. The church is very tall, and the installation also took up a huge effort, but eventually the hard work paid off. Here's another look. Here's a look from a different perspective to observe how complex the procedure is. This is an empty window. This is outside of the church. And this is the first sketch. And this is the actual transparency color sketch until finally a complete set of the stained glass window. Well, we just went through a very complex procedure within less than a minute, but keep in mind, there are 35 windows altogether on each church floor. And each window consists of 11 panels, and each panel is made of anywhere between 4 to 50 small pieces of glasses, different sizes, shapes, and colors. In other words, each window consists approximately 425 pieces of glasses. And how many pieces of 25 windows will have? 14,875 pieces. And this is just one of the 3 floors. And if we are impressed by the bamboos and roses and peonies and lilies in the design of the previous stained glass window, and on the first floor, there will be biblical stories. And then with particular Chinese paper cut style. And then presenting to the people of the Bible story. No wonder this project became a true sensation in China towards the end of the first decade of the 21st century, and this project was widely reported by local and international media. It was advertised as one of the 10 must-sees in New Shanghai. And among the tourists then was no other than this particular person, and the German chancellor. And after she visited the stained glass project, she was so impressed. And then a few hours later, she sent her secretary with 2,000 euros as a donation. Quite impressive. And this is a true remarkable story and experience of cross-cultural encounters between East and West today. But like many incidents in history, especially those in China, this experience has its own twists and turns. 3 years ago, the bishop who has been the backbone of the project passed away. Although the Zigaway area has never stopped being a commercial and cultural activity center of the city, the subtle political and social changes relating to religion, especially Christian religion, can be felt everywhere. Meanwhile, the continuing underground construction in the city of Shanghai has disturbed and fractured the structure of the 100-year-old cathedral, forcing it to close down for renovation. As part of the renovation, all of the stained glass windows have been taken down. As of today, nobody knows its future, whether the windows will be going up again or permanently stored away somewhere. Nobody's doing up. So when I asked the artist over a week ago how she felt, she was silent for a long time. Then she said very softly, "This is not the first time things of this kind have happened in Zigaway, and it will not be the last. You understand." The stained glass windows are no longer there today, and I was not able to see the inside of the church during the past visit of myself in Shanghai. But I know, after much thinking, that the light will always shine through the stained glass window of everybody's heart. Thank you very much.
Okay, so I'm very grateful to Dr. Wu for, he will remain with us on the screen, I guess, but to introduce us to this very interesting part of Shanghai's history. And I don't know how many of you have been to the Shanghai Library, which still survives to this day with an excellent collection of old newspapers in foreign languages, as well as a missionary library that I visit every time that I'm in Shanghai. And that's, of course, also a legacy of the Jesuit order in China. So we're going to move on, and the next speaker is going to be Professor Wang Zhang from History and Women's Studies, who's going to speak on another view of China today. And I think you're probably going to talk a little bit about your new book, perhaps. All right. Okay.
Over 60 slides, so I have to go very fast. Okay, so my topic will be very different from Dr. Wu's topic. So I think Joseph, when organizing this event, he tried to tap the expertise among the faculty here at the University of Michigan. So I'm a historian of modern China, and my special field is women gender in modern China, and also the history of Chinese feminism. So today my topic is feminist struggles in a changing China. This is largely based on my recently published book, Finding Women in the State, a Socialist Feminist Revolution in the People's Republic of China, 1949 to 1964. Of course, today I'm going to bring the whole talk to exactly today, 1949 to today, exactly. Because right before I came here, I was hurriedly sent some photos from my WeChat in the cell phone to my laptop and put in the PPT slides today, included here. So by discussing activities of 3 cohorts of Chinese feminists in the People's Republic of China from 1949 to today, I intended to explain tensions, contradictions, and contentions in a rapidly changing China from a gender perspective. So these are the three cohorts I'm going to cover in today's talk. Chinese feminist agitations actually began at the end of the Qing dynasty following China's defeat in the Sino-Japanese War in 1895. By the early 1920s, progressive elite, men and women, especially those on the left, agreed that changing Chinese patriarchal gender system was a precondition of moving this ancient country towards modernity. So, because I want to speed up, I'll leave the slides to you for you to read. Can you see it from the back? Okay, if everything is visible, then I'm not going to read the slides, so I can move on fast. So, attracting women to the revolution was high on the CCP's agenda since day one, since its inception. And women work, 妇女工作, was institutionalized in the party early on. China in 1949 was an agrarian society with about 90% of its total population, 540 million, residing in rural areas. 90% of women in 1949 being illiterate. And an economy devastated by decades of wars. So economic recovery with women's participation and increasing women's literacy were high on the CCP's agenda for a socialist modernity. The victory of the CCP in 1949 enabled feminists in the party to wield socialist state power to materialize their feminist dreams. Over the long course of the communist revolution, hundreds and thousands of women joined the Communist Party. In 1949, of the Communist Party's membership of 4.4 million, 530,000 were women. Of course, many more died during the over 20 years of revolution, either on the battleground or killed on the execution ground by the Kuomintang or by Japanese, by local warlords. Many died in the course. But the exact number in 1949 was around 530,000. These were women. Many of these women, CCP women, rose to official positions in administrations ranging from the central government to urban street offices and the rural townships, depending on their party seniority and the level of education. Although we do not claim that each CCP woman was a conscious feminist, the numbers and the power of Chinese socialist state feminists in the early People's Republic of China were arguably unprecedented in feminist histories of the world. This was a consequence of a feminist-informed communist revolution in the world's most populous nation that attracted the female constituencies with equality between men and women as an integral goal of the revolution. Upon the founding of the PRC, many CCP feminists in their official capacity vigorously initiated and promoted transformative programs to cash the party's promissory note of women's thorough liberation in a socialist country. This belies the general assumption in much of the scholarship in English that these communist women were passive followers of a male-dominated party. The first national women's organization, organized by senior CCP feminists Deng Yingchao and Cai Chang, these are the top three leaders. I guess you all know Song Qingling, right? Madame Song Yishan. She has a lot of published in English. But the other two you may not know. Who is Deng Yingchao? Anybody knows? Hmm? In the middle, yeah, I would like to hear the audience here. Anybody knows who is Deng Yingchao? In 1925, Deng Yingchao married a young communist man called Zhou Enlai. And Cai Chang, that they got married in Guangzhou when there was a revolutionary center. There's a coalition between Nationalist Party and the Communist Party during that period. And Cai Chang is on this side. She married a young communist man in 1923 in Paris. And that young man's name was Li Fuchuan, later became vice premier of the PRC. So, in other words, these women, senior party members, on their own right, but they didn't have cabinet positions in the PRC. Okay? Because like Zhou Enlai, they said, hey, Sister Deng had seniority and ability, she should have a cabinet position. Zhou Enlai said, oh no, I'm the premier, how can I have my wife, in the cabinet? So she's out of the picture to be in the formal power structure. So Deng Yingchao and Cai Chang, they set up an All China Women's Federation. Okay, that's their base. It's a mass organization. Okay, so they set up that before the party officially moved into Beijing. They set the organization in March 1949, and immediately they started the institutional building of this organization. We call it Fulian, 全国妇联 All China Women's Federation. And this organization was an umbrella organization that horizontally united all pro-CCP women's organizations and an official institution that vertically reached down to the rural villages and the urban neighborhoods nationwide. These are all done by these communist women. Okay, no men involved in their institutional building, in their planning, nothing. It's their turf, their organization. I would call this as the socialist state, the structure of socialist state from a gender perspective. This vast organizational reach enabled socialist state feminists to effectively carry out many transformative actions nationwide. The very first law adopted by the socialist state, the 1950 marriage law, drafted by a feminist committee led by Deng Yingchao, was a centerpiece in the socialist feminist mission of transforming Chinese feudalist culture. Feudalist, that's a key word in the socialist state feminist endeavor. The law enforced dismantling of traditional marriage practices, such as arranged marriage, we all know that, and underage marriage, and granted women freedom to divorce and to remarry, establishing new gender norms of equality between men and women with state power. Women's literacy, equal employment and equal pay, political participation, reproductive health, and new public facilities to reduce working women's burden of child care and housework were also areas of remarkable feminist achievements in the early PRC. Their efforts to involve and engage rural and urban lower-class women, particularly in all the transformative programs aiming to eliminate class and gender hierarchies, expanded urban elite-based feminist concepts and practices of women's rights from the first half of the 20th century. That said, the socialist state paradoxically paradoxically widened the gap between the rural and urban by setting up a two-tier household registration system that offered urban residents more privileges and material goods in order to speed up industrialization. Rural women had much fewer opportunities to higher education than rural men, when patriarchal norms still dominated poor rural society. Socialist feminists' comprehensive vision of Chinese women's liberation crucially hinged on a transformation of subjectivities, worldviews. Senior feminists were acutely aware that without undoing a patriarchal culture that saturated the psyches of the people and the CCP members, efforts to achieve women's equality in all spheres of life would encounter severe obstacles and resistance. Cultural production was thus also an important realm in socialist feminist transformation, a heritage from the May 4th New Culture movement, when progressive intellectuals, a cohort that included many men, produced a massive amount of literature and drama to condemn a feudalist, patriarchal tradition embodied in Confucianism. The Chinese term feudalism in socialist film, at the time, it's also already a state-owned industry and led by female and male feminist leaders. So the term feudalism in socialist film, novels, and operas decidedly represented the other. The feudalism has now become the other of socialist New China. It actually became a gender-inflected keyword encompassing everything we today call sexism, masculinism, patriarchy, male chauvinism, and all misogyny, all these terms, all these meanings that are embedded in this term, feudalism, in mainland China. Even illiterate women in rural areas could deploy the term effortlessly to accuse men of chauvinism, just say, oh, you are so feudal. Okay. Equality between men and women and the women's liberation popularized via state-owned media and cultural production, of course, especially the Women Federation, All China Women's Federation's magazine, Women in China, Women of China, and the socialist films, they made it accessible even to rural communities. So these terms, equality between men and women, 男女平等, 妇女解放. 5 minutes? Oh my gosh. Okay, I have to really speed up. Because I have 3 cohorts, I haven't finished 1 cohort yet. So a socialist feminist gender discourse rapidly rose to the dominant mainstream discourse in the early PRC. Okay, so this is the Daughters of China, 1949 production, already portrayed the heroines in the revolution. I contrasted with Hollywood production. Okay. That's just recent film. You still portrayed those masculine men. Actually, in the Hollywood, real hero appeared only a few years ago. Hunger Game, right? So these are the images from the Women's Federation's magazine, Women of China. You can see that they focused on representing women moving into male domains and also ordinary workers and peasants, you know. So I will skip this hidden history. That's what I was discussing in my book. That's a major part in my book. So, all these efforts and accomplishments in the socialist period have remained unknown to people in China and, of course, people outside. And then a major erasure of socialist data feminists arose in the production of historical knowledge of socialism since the late 1970s, when the CCP began to depart from the socialist cause after Mao's death in 1976. In Chinese intellectuals' concerted critique of the CCP's crimes under Mao Zedong's dictatorship, descriptions of the socialist period were mainly limited to condemnations of its ills, and Mao became synonymous with socialism. The anti-socialist discourse was both grossly reductive and openly masculinist. The post-socialist intellectuals' efforts to dismantle both the CCP's authoritarian rule and socialist egalitarian values and practices. Socialist data feminist gender ideology and practices that promoted equality between men and women were characterized as the Maoist state's imposition of gender sameness, a crime of the CCP that distorted Chinese women's natural femininity and masculinized Chinese women. Here just as a quote from an article by a male sociologist, Zheng Yefu, published in the prestigious Chinese academic journal, Sociological Studies, in 1994. It's quite representative of the rhetoric of the time. For you to have a glimpse of a post-socialist masculinist backlash against socialist gender equality practices. Okay, so now let's move to, so against this kind of, backlash, a new cohort of feminists emerged, especially with the opportunity of hosting the fourth UN Conference on Women in 1995, emerged a new cohort of feminists. And this cohort of feminists, basically my cohort, beneficiaries of gender equality policies during the socialist period. Okay. So, riding on the mandate of the UN, that is to mainstream gender mainstreaming, Chinese feminists began to organize non-governmental organizations, that is NGO. So in the following decade, after 1995, NGOs in China, first is women's NGOs, feminist promoted NGOs, and then spread to other social groups. So NGO became a very drastically developed phenomenon in the social realm activities, social movements. All right. So for the feminists, they organized around anti-domestic violence. The poster they made with movie stars, and I just go quickly all these activities. They hosting the women's counseling centers and organize rural women, and also there's my activism. I'm both a scholar and an activist in running women's studies workshops, faculty training programs, and hosting feminist conferences. And the feminists also organizing rural women's political participation and encourage rural women to run for local offices, village offices, and also staged vagina monologues as a way to transform Chinese sexist norms and the sexual cultures, and running gender training workshops everywhere. Okay, so maybe that one should just read a few minutes. Okay, now I move on the third cohort. So in the second decade, especially entered the second decade after 1995, then the Chinese government started to be very alarmed by the rapid development of NGOs. So a lot of action, starting from 2005, the Chinese government consciously started to do a bunch of things, either to sabotage NGOs, to close down NGOs, or to co-opt NGOs, all kind of stuff is going on since 2005. At the same time, a younger generation of feminists emerged on the stage of social activism, disregarding the tightening political control. I would say that a demographic factor in combination with China's drastic economic development has prepared the rise of these young feminists. The one-child policy since 1979 resulted in an unprecedented number of single daughters, the lucky ones who were not aborted, who enjoyed all the resources their families from both parents' sides could afford for their education and personal development. The coming of age of these little princesses coincided with China's huge expansion of college education, which tapped the educational market based on an expanding middle class. Okay, so that slide gives you a concept. A large cohort of well-educated young women from diverse social and economic backgrounds with high aspirations for themselves as well as high expectations from their families, contradictorily has encountered excessive gender discrimination and pervasive masculinist sexual norms that openly treat women as sex objects and secondary citizens. Inspired by feminism, young women nevertheless have few social resources or make their voices heard, let alone to participate in the policy-making process as the feminists of older cohorts have been able to do. But it turns out that social and economic marginality does not necessarily disempower the young, educated urban feminists who have been brought up in the age of cyberspace and of new conceptual frameworks circulating globally. The young feminists have quickly identified a powerful medium for feminist engagement, the internet. And because they are not embedded in the official system and have no circumventing considerations associated with those who have some social status, they are far less restricted in conceptualizing the possibilities of their actions. As a result, we have witnessed many innovative actions initiated by young feminists who have nothing to lose. Now, next you are going to see a bunch of slides. These are all by their innovative activity. This is starting from 3 years ago, I think, or 4 years ago by now, occupying menstrual. Okay? And they became sensational. Their strategy is to be visible, in your face, and take a few pictures in a public space. You don't have to allow the resources, just have a cell phone, take a picture and put it on, upload on the internet. Wow, everybody will pay attention to it, okay? So actually that action led to concrete policy change. Just starting from I think last year, the Chinese government decided that all in the public space, the government buildings everywhere, the ratio between men's schools and women's should be 1 versus 1.5. So it's already public policy, okay? So this is to challenge to protesting the discrimination in enrollment. The Chinese universities, started to require like 20, 30 points higher to accept female students because women doing too well. Okay, I have a few more slides to finish. This is to protest sexual harassment in public space. This is to protest domestic violence. And we know as a result, in the end of 2015, anti-domestic violence became a law passed after 20 years of struggle by feminists in China. And this is more sensational. It's also anti-domestic violence, anti-sexual harassment, there's anti-homophobia, this is anti-discrimination against pregnant women in employment. And this you may know, the detention feminist fight, because these 5 women wanted to post anti-sexual harassment posters on the public transportation, and they were arrested. But on the eve of Women's Day, in 2015, and then the whole world started mobilized, demanding their release and global mobilization and protests in China. In the end, after about 40 days, they were released. A big success for feminists in the whole world. Okay, and this is another media action last year, last March the 8th, International Women's Day. When feminists started a blog, and then it got 101 million visits. Okay, huge, massive organization. And also these pictures, for you also see, there's a transnational influence. They use Rosie the Rivet a lot, okay, to legitimize. And just now, at the moment, on May 1st, just a week ago, about a young woman submitted a request to the city in Guangzhou, saying that I would like to, put a billboard with the message of anti-sexual harassment in the public space, in the transportation. The city said, no individual or NGOs can put a billboard. Okay, you have to be government organization to be the billboard. So she said, okay, you don't allow me to have a billboard, I'm going to start a mobile billboard campaign. So she started and took a picture of herself and then put it online. That's May 1st. Then today, this morning, that's why I'm hurriedly doing it, I found, oh my gosh. And she already got a campaign going on. Now students all over China send in their posters, their billboards. It's called mobile billboards, anti-sexual harassment. And so everywhere, all over China, now young students and send in, they just carry this. And some also send in the request saying that, oh, can you make it into a t-shirt? Say, okay, how many people want it? Then they say, oh, we want a t-shirt. So she said, okay, I'm going to make a lot of t-shirts. Anybody want to order it, let me know. We are going to carry it on t-shirt. So young men also joined, okay? And groups, this is from the picture from all over China. Okay, so, and they also went to kindergartens to educate parents and children, and also soliciting sports teams and everywhere. So this is an ongoing activism currently, just today, they're still doing that. So I just, in conclusion, I just want to second, I would like to second Ambassador's assessment of the grave contradiction in contemporary China. He said yesterday that a pre-modern political system versus a modernizing society is a huge contradiction in contemporary China. I totally second this assessment, but I want to elaborate it in a more concrete manner. The pre-modern political system grown on the soil of an agrarian society is in essence a patriarchal system based on the patrilineal kinship system with its hallmark of controlling women. The modernity of Chinese society today is most notably signified by its large number of highly educated women dispersed in all kinds of professions and walks of life who cannot be expected to return to a pre-modern gender order, sacrificing themselves in order to maintain male privilege and male dominance. Based on this assessment of the fundamental contradiction, I would expect young Chinese women to be the most significant social force to engender profound transformations of China's pre-modern patriarchal political and cultural systems. Thank you.
Okay, and our next speaker will be Professor Mary Gallagher from the Department of Political Science, and also is our dear leader and the director of the Lieberthal-Rogel Center for Chinese Studies, who is known for her book Contagious Capitalism, and is also working on labor relations. So without further ado.
So, thank you, Tara, and thank you Joseph for organizing this great conference. And thank you all from the Shanghai American School for coming to Ann Arbor. We appreciate it. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Talking in the mic? Okay.
Yes.
So I'm going to get probably text from my daughter that'll pop up on the screen telling me to hurry up to pick her up from school. So just disregard those. She's 15, so she can wait. She'll be fine. Yeah, well, exactly. So I'm going to talk today about a topic that is part of a book that I have coming out this year called Authoritarian Legality in China, and it is about whether or not this switch that Ambassador Roy talked about yesterday to rule by law will actually allow the Chinese government to sort of avoid some of the pressures of political change and political liberalization that these middle income, sort of rapidly developing countries usually encounter. And as he pointed out yesterday, Korea and Taiwan went through those processes and ended up democratizing. And the Chinese Communist Party would like to adopt these institutions in a kind of halfway step without going towards full-blown political change. And so the book is really about whether or not this can work. And in a sense, it's can be sort of summarized by the term that in Chinese, 法治 is actually not really clearly translated into English as rule of law or rule by law. So of course, in Western democracies, we think of rule of law as very important, and the thing that China has adopted is not rule of law, but rather rule by law, by which the ruling party, which is not elected democratically, uses law as a tool of governance. And the book asks this question of why the government has done this, at least in regards to workers and labor. Why has it passed legislation, passed laws to grant workers more rights? Why it has publicized these rights in the media and in the propaganda system so that people know about the laws, and then why has it encouraged workers to make use of these laws? At least it used to encourage workers to use these laws. It's not as encouraging anymore under Xi Jinping. So what I argue in the book is that this is a kind of developmental trap that the government is in. You might think of it as part of the middle income trap, where it has to expand these protections to workers in order to realize some of its goals of urbanization and of moving up the technology ladder and becoming more developed and having a higher, more highly skilled and more highly educated workforce. So it needs to give people protection so that they stay at workplaces longer, so that they participate in things like social insurance and have stability and employment and social security in the long run. And so these things are sort of things that most states think about as they reach middle income. And this is partly a top-down story in China because they have very high ambitions about what should happen to its economy. But at the same time, there's also sort of bottom-up pressure from workers, some of the people that Wang Zheng was talking about as feminist activists, highly educated, white-collar workers who want these protections. For example, they want not to be fired when they get pregnant. And so this is part of this process of urbanization and modernization that China is going through. And so it's done this with labor, at least on the books, or by the book, that employment security and other types of protections like overtime in China are among the highest protections in the world. They're actually above Germany. The recent laws have had some effects too. They've expanded the number of people in the formal sector. They've increased the number of people who are participating in social insurance, like pensions and medical insurance and occupational injury. And these are part of the government's long-term goals. So this is just gives you a sense of comparing China. China is the far right. It's sort of the checkered country, and those are other developing countries. But the black line is the OECD average. So average of developed rich countries is below China's on-the-book protections at the workplace. With this higher protection of rights on the book, they've also done a lot through the media and also to some extent via NGOs, as well as the propaganda system at schools and workplaces, to educate people about their rights. And so in survey work that we did across a number of different cities in China, it was the number of people who know about sort of their basic rights is very, very high. About 75% of the population that was surveyed had what we would say like a passing grade if you ask them about, do you know the minimum wage? Do you know that you're entitled to a contract? Do you know, what are the terms upon which you can be terminated? That people had what we were surprised to see very high rates of awareness. And this is necessary because the government has really passed these laws and then publicized these laws, but not done anything really institutionally to help people use these laws. So it's really given enforcement and compliance to the workers themselves. You can go and you can sue your employer, you can take them to arbitration, and then you can take them to court. But basically you're going to be doing that on your own, unless you can afford a lawyer, which of course most people can't. So the legal dissemination campaigns are quite well known in China. They were started in the 80s as part of Deng Xiaoping's move to law as opposed to rule of man. For ordinary citizens, popularizing the knowledge of law not only aims to make them know the laws and abide by them, more importantly, it is enabling them to use the laws as a weapon to protect their lawful rights and interests. So this was part of the initial campaign and then summarized in a 2008 white paper on China's rule of law. So there have been effects of these laws, like I mentioned. They've increased protections, they've reduced informality, they've also increased wages, although increasing wages has a lot to do with China's demographic change and the decline of the working population as people have had fewer children and people live longer. But what it's also done is it's radically increased the number of disputes and strikes that occur. So people are actually taking these laws seriously and they're using them to try to protect their rights. And this is just a chart that gives you a sense of the bump in disputes every time a new law is passed. So the labor contract law, which was passed in 2008, the social insurance law, which was passed in 2010, and China Labor Bulletin, which is an NGO out of Hong Kong. This gives you a little bit of a sense of the strikes that have increased over time. This is the strikes from 2011 and 2016, and the size of the circle is how big it was in that city, and of course it's concentrated on the coast, particularly in places like Guangdong and around Shanghai. So we see these effects of the laws. We see people using them to try to protect themselves, and then we also see rising disputes, which most lawyers would tell you that's what happens when you pass laws. People use them to try to protect their rights and create disputes. In addition to sort of the legal channels, this arbitration and litigation that workers go through, there's also been these sort of more dramatic strikes and demonstrations. And as with the feminists, people get very creative because social media is important to strikes. It's not just about the people who are going to see you in public, in person, it's also who is going to see you on WeChat or on Weibo. And my favorite, of course, is the guys on the top wearing the leather jackets who were not being paid their wages, and so they danced Gangnam Style, which was popular in 2012, one of the years I was living in China, and did a dance and then posted it so that people would pay attention to their plight. We had very big strikes about social insurance. Over 40,000 migrant workers striking in a factory making sneakers for export in 2014. So the argument that I make in the book is that this is a sort of institutional trap for the government, because the government has tried to create these laws and protections because they need them for their urbanization goals. But at the same time, they've done absolutely nothing to increase sort of the institutional apparatuses that help people with lawsuits. So if you think about workers, you might say, well, trade unions should help workers with lawsuits or collective bargaining, or you should have legal aid and sort of representation that might be means tested so that people without high salaries could make use of this. Those things haven't happened. So trade unions have not been expanded or liberalized. Collective bargaining has really not taken off. The government is very worried about collective action because it fears that it would lead to political protest. And so what you have are workers trying to do this on their own and becoming extremely disappointed. And this is something that I did both through qualitative interviews, talking to workers one-on-one after their disputes, and also in surveys. And so the people who don't have actual experience with the law have very good opinion of the law. And then people who have experience with the law have very low opinion of the law. Now you might say that's not unique to China, and I will agree, it is not unique to China, but it is dangerous for China because it means that these institutions that have been set up are not working well. and creating a kind of cycle of law and then instability, and then the government then has to step in to put down collective action coming out of legal conflict. So one example of this problem is sort of this famous strike that occurred in 2014 in a Walmart store in central China, in Changde City in Hunan province. It's somewhat unusual in the sense that the union actually at the store level got involved and actually tried to protect the workers, because that's often difficult for the union. But how it turns out is sort of very, very typical. So the store was closing. Walmart has closed about 10% of its stores in China after the financial crisis. And they were sort of consolidating their stores. They were closing the store. They announced it to the workers, and they said they were going to give them a settlement. The settlement, I would say, was at the legal minimum. Like, it was exactly, Walmart is really good at this. It was exactly what they would give to stay within the line of to the letter of the law, but nothing over that. And the workers wanted more. That some of them had worked for a long time there, and they weren't going to be able necessarily to find good positions elsewhere. The union, this is Chairman Huang, he decided to help the workers at the store level. He organized the workers, and then the workers did sort of civil disobedience and sort of peaceful protests, like blocking the delivery trucks and doing things like that to stop the store from moving the goods. They were actually closing down the store and moving the goods to another location. And then the state stepped in, the union was shut down, the upper level trade union at the city level came in and told Chairman Huang that he was instructed only to demand the legal minimum, which I love that phrase where a trade union is telling, is told, the trade union tells one of their officers that you can only demand and protest for the legal minimum. Because the legal minimum is actually what you're just supposed to get. I mean, it's not something you're supposed to have to protest for. But it sort of defines this problem of this kind of empowerment and then disenchantment. The strike was then disbanded. A number of workers decided to file lawsuits, and then, of course, they filed lawsuits that they lost, because the law is not an effective institutional place for interest disputes where workers are demanding something above the law. They were actually getting the legal minimum from Walmart, but they were trying to collectively bargain for more, and that was shut down. So in conclusion, this is just sort of an example from my research of this problem of sort of the institutional trap that countries like China, which are not yet democratic but have these rising expectations, not just from below, but also from the government itself, which is a very ambitious government. It's a government that sees China as becoming, or already a superpower, and that it is looking for these sorts of institutional reforms that bypass democracy, but at the same time realize some of the rights and other principles that democracy might grant people, like security and things like that. So it's this institutional gap, and it was summed up by a speech that Xi Jinping, the current president, made in 2014, which was a period where China was reforming again, and rule of law was being touted as a way to push China forward, as well as the market, as Ambassador Roy mentioned yesterday. They need this rights expansion for long-term development goals, but these protections are often not realized given the sort of institutional trap that the government is in, where they're giving rights, but they're not giving the institutions that you need to actually gain these rights in practice. And in the speech, he said this phrase that rights protection is the foundation of stability preservation. The crux of stability preservation is rights protection. So they have this idea that stability and rights are connected, but they have not yet figured out this puzzle of how do they protect rights in the current political environment. So I'll stop there, and I'm happy to take questions with my other speakers. Thank you.
Right, so I think we have time for a handful of questions before we disperse for about 5 minutes, according to the chairman on the back. No. So if it's a question, perhaps we should take like 3 questions, then answer. So first question.
Okay, I have a question for Professor Wang Zhen. So there are about 74 million left-behind Chinese women in China, in rural area, especially in my province, Sichuan, Yunnan, Guizhou, are left behind to take care of the children, take care of their in-laws, and they do all the farm work. So they have increasing workloads, and they have physical and psychological problems. So could you tell me what we should do to help them? Thank you.
So the second, more questions? Okay, groups of three. So yes.
Professor Gallagher describes rule of law, rule by law, as institutional trap. With regard to feminism, you describe it as a sort of social psychological transformation. How do they relate, or how much can you get by law that may not or may try the cultural and the long history of China?
I'm going to pass lesson to Rebecca. Yes, please. Yes, okay.
Professor Gallagher,
Yes.
I'd be interested whether there is academic work has been done on the question of whether a society that has essentially been lawless and then moves to a rule by law regime, is that a stepping stone to rule of law, or does it tend to end at the rule by law level? I just wonder whether there, in looking at different societies that have progressed along this continuum, whether one can make an argument that rule by law can precede rule of law.
Sure. Because I'm just going to have to run out to go pick up.
All right. Yes.
So, so that first question about in a way, I think those two questions are sort of similar because they're both about how law relates to sort of maybe deep-rooted historical or cultural factors. And I think this is a kind of more of a comparative question. I don't think it's necessarily a question that's unique to China. And Ambassador Roy didn't really frame it that way either, that do we have examples of countries that have moved along this continuum? So I think for the Chinese case, and this is what I tell my students when we talk about this and we talk about comparative politics, although there are certainly people, I think, who disagree or who say somehow that democratic rule or rule of law in some non-Western societies is not really what it looks like, or sometimes people will say Western democracies and they'll lump in Japan, and people will point out, well, you're also talking about Japan, and Japan is not a Western democracy, nor is Korea or Taiwan, for that matter. So I think it's those kinds of countries that you have to point to, those countries that do not have that the historical connection to what Westerners perceive as something that happened quite unique in the early modern period in Western Europe that related to bargaining between kings and lords and eventually led to this gradual democratization process. I would, as I point out to my students, a very gradual democratization project. So such that the UK, which we think of as the longest democracy in the world, didn't grant suffrage to women until the early 20th century, so earlier than the US. But and so that's really, I think, more the fundamental issue for countries like China, which is that when we look at sort of Western experience with democracy, we often forget that Western democracy took a very long time, and it was a long cultural evolution, and even in terms of women's suffrage and things like patriarchy, of course, we often, if you're doing quantitative analysis on democracies, we will code the United States as a democracy since its inception. However, we could also say, well, it really wasn't a democracy until 1920, or you could say it really wasn't a democracy until the Voting Rights Act in the 1960s. So I think the problem for countries like China is that they don't have the luxury of this gradual process, nor do any other countries who are going through the same process in other continents. They are going from 0 to 60, right? They are going from maybe absolute authoritarian rule where China is ruled by a very few number of people to something where you might have universal suffrage. And I think that is a much more dangerous process and destabilizing process.
Yeah, to follow Mary's comment that actually Mary's comment already prepared for my answer, that China moved away, not actually away, attempted to move away, okay, from a patriarchal authoritarian political system and also not just political system, it's a patriarchal culture everywhere, and attempted to move towards a modern, more egalitarian society, and including giving equal citizenship to women, as Mary mentioned. That in the West is just very, very recent history. Okay, so but China tried to make this long historical process that happened in other country in a compressed period of time. So I have a word, I have a concept that China is in the period of compressed temporality. Okay, we try to compress everything in a very short period of time. That's why a lot of contradictions and tensions and struggles are extremely intensely felt by a different group of people. Okay? And also this kind of efforts or attempts to move China away from a patriarchal, male-dominated, pre-modern political cultural system towards a more modern society with a concept of equal rights and human rights to every citizen. This kind of attempts you will encounter. Socialist revolution, Communist revolution was one of the most obvious this kind of attempt. Okay, trying to move the society towards away from the pre-modern system. However, it's embedded deeply in the quagmire of this patriarchal system. That's why it automatically reproduces all these patriarchal mentality and hierarchical way of doing things, and institutionalize all these pre-modern political systems practices. Okay, so and also meanwhile, it's radical components like socialist feminists, very radical. These women in the party, they genuinely wanted to move the society forward because they didn't have the gender privilege, the male privilege that's in the patriarchal society. They had all the intention to move society forward. However, with their push, their radical push, with their state power, they instantly encountered a tremendous resistance from the social forces. And this kind of story we can see very clearly, right, in this country as well. The progressive forces pushed forward, the conservative forces were pushed backwards. Okay, so it's kind of a tug of war. Okay, just back and forth, back and forth. So we could see that in China it's happening right away, all along in the past 100 years, and especially the communist revolution, and they succeeded in taking over the state power. They made a lot of accomplishments and radically transformed the cultural norms in terms of gender relations, but then they will be pushed back. And of course, meanwhile, the patriarchal mentalities and masculinist way of doing things and the rules of the games, they continued, and Mao became an emperor, right? So everything is kind of all mingled. All these different forces and the different ideologies, and I call different discourses. I say that, today's China, we are compressed with the modern nation state, the dream of modern nation state, right? Starting from Sun Yat-sen's revolution, we have to follow the Westerners to build a modern China and to build a republic. That's the 1911 revolution, okay? And then there's the communist revolution. We want to have all for equality, social justice for everybody, egalitarian society. That's the communist dreams. And then you emerged American dreams. That's Deng Xiaoping upholded American dreams, right? And unfortunately, most people in China at the time, embracing the American dream, they are more impressed by American capitalist consumerism. So American dreams is interpreted as just everybody has a house and a car, material goods, possession of all kinds of material goods, nothing else. Okay, it's not democracy, it's not human rights. For the great majority, like yesterday said, they on the internet, 90% are playing games, not really doing other things. So that's American dream for Chinese citizens, all right? And then you see there's another layer of dream. that emerged when China became economically powerful, that is Confucius' dream. Coming back, that Xi Jinping is talking about, we want to restore the glorious ancient civilization to return to the ancient glory, ancient Chinese empire's time. Okay, so this kind of 4 layers of dreams, I call the discourses, all existing today in China, compressed, simultaneously compressed today, and competing, fighting against each other. So that's how complex it is. And then the rural women's question, in the socialist period, even though, as I mentioned very briefly, that even though the party practiced the 2-tier citizenship, right? Rural people on the whole, men and women, were disadvantaged in this process because they produced more, but they didn't get anything in return from the state. As the urban people, privileged urban dwellers, were able to get goods back from the state, right? But still, in the discursive level, at the discursive level, rural people were regarded as the backbones of a socialist state. Peasants and workers, and they were regarded as the social group that making major contribution to the socialist modernity, socialist construction. However, in the post-socialist period, in China's embracing with global capitalism, then the ideology also changed. And what is increasingly becoming dominant is social Darwinism. And so the rural peasants or urban laid-off workers, these were all regarded as failures, those losers, okay? And lower-class people with low qualities, they couldn't become successful because they're dumb, they have low qualities. So even at the discursive level, they were bearing all these stigmas of being poor, being lower class. Okay? Not just economically. Economically, they were also deprived as well. So for rural women, yes, that they are the most downtrodden social group in a sense. Feminists worked with them, but not enough. Very, very sporadic efforts in China happening to try to improve rural women's conditions. And also, as I noted, that there's efforts to promote rural women to run for village offices, to run for township offices, try to involve women in political participation as a way to change rural women's conditions. But this kind of efforts was not really promoted by the government. Okay? That's not a state attention at the moment. So in the end, Chinese women, whichever social groups, wherever you are in the very hierarchical social structure today, women have to rely on their own to fight collectively. Thank you.
All right.
Just wanted to give you a heads up that we will be having concluding remarks by Professor Para Castle, Associate Director of the Center for Chinese Studies, in a minute or so. So if you can find your seats and get comfortable, Professor Castle will be addressing us on concluding remarks regarding the symposium as well as the conference as a whole. Thank you.
So, as you probably can guess from the program, I'm making these remarks in lieu of Professor Mary Gallagher, who was unable to give the concluding remarks. And I'm speaking here both as the Associate Director of the Lieberthal-Rogel Center of Chinese Studies, as well as my academic advisor of Professor Joseph Ho, who will soon take up his faculty position at the Elgin College. I'm going to start by going through the conference and making some professional and also personal remarks where I think these symposium touched me on both a professional and personal level, and then I'm going to conclude with some remarks pertaining to the Lieberthal-Rogel Center for Chinese Studies, which has been co-sponsoring this event along with the History Department of University of Michigan at Eisenberg Institute for Historical Studies, as well as the Shanghai American School Alumni Association. And I just want to start to say, if I'm any part of this conference, or if I can be vicariously part of Joseph's great works, was the realization that when Joe was working on his dissertation research, that he was actually creating an archive. He was creating an archive in the sense that he was assembling material that by its very nature is dispersed and intensely personal. I'm going to get back to that in a moment. And that he had also created, and building on his own networks, that Joe has been very silent on this, but he also has, a personal history behind these projects and relationships. And it came to a point, I think about 3 years ago, when Joe had returned from the last convention of the SAS alumni, that the idea arose to organize this conference. And another event was that when Joe showed me one of his batches of slides, the color slides that you saw at the end of his presentation earlier today, with this crisp quality of springtime in Shanghai in 1949. And this, for us, who've grown up in an era with only color photography, this kind of shocking authenticity of these pictures. And I just felt I just needed to do something about my own reactions. I just picked up the phone and I called the Michigan Record and our own kind of propaganda organ and said, you guys have a real story here. You should definitely pick this up, because you have a entrepreneurial graduate student who's gathered some fantastic visual records that can be used. And I thought it would stay there, because I called them all the time and they would listen to me. But this time they did, and it ended up with Joe becoming, in a sense, the poster boy of our institution. A full-length article, as well as a featured report on the International Public Radio, and a very well-received panel at the Association for Asian Studies annual meeting, I think it was in Chicago, that really got this up. And if you're interested in those material, Joe has posted some of those on his website. But this has been a great conference that has emerged out of many of these labors, and I'm going to mention as many people as I can. And it brings together not only the alumni of the SAS, but also the Chinese studies community of the University of Michigan, that all of have contributed to this event. And I'm really happy that you elected to hold your 10th reunion. I think it was the 10th reunion, right? Here in Michigan and Ann Arbor. And I'm also, as an advisor, very grateful for you so generously sharing your stories, your material, your photographs, and hospitality, personal hospitality to Joe during the course of his dissertation. That for me, it's a fantastic experience to talk to you and realize, oh, this is chapter 3, this is chapter 4, when you talk about your parents. So let's walk through the conference, what we covered today, and some of my reflections. So the first panel was Joseph Ho, Professor Charlie Bright, and my predecessor in the history department, Ernest Young, who brought up and discussed the Republican China Sino-Western relations in peace and war. These were all really wonderful presentations that are of acute relevance to Joe's work and also to your personal experiences in China. I think of Charlie Bright's grandfather's experiences in his letter in Hangzhou during the war, and how these things bring, with clarity, the interaction between everyday life and great power and politics as they were felt at the time. And then Professor Young brought very generously up my own book on extraterritoriality and treaty ports, and I'm a person who has experienced the treaty ports through books, through archives. And here today and yesterday I've been experiencing the treaty ports through you, who actually were in Shanghai when it still was a treaty port, who were in China when extraterritoriality was a fact of life. And one of the reasons why the treaty ports are interesting to me as an historian is that they don't have a central archive. If you're studying the history of France, there are like 2 or 3 archives you go to. If you study history of my beloved country, Sweden, there's like 1 or 2 archives you can visit. But if you're doing the study of treaty ports, then you will have to travel a lot. You have to be prepared to go to a number of countries. You have to learn a number of languages. And it's a period of Chinese history that's acutely relevant for understanding of modernity and change, and the things that Professor Roy brought up in his remarks yesterday. And of course, on one hand, in the West, we have a kind of a post-colonial sense of that the treaty ports is an embarrassing episode for Western countries, and in many ways it was. And in China, of course, you have the rejection of the treaty ports as a kind of a non-authentic way of China. This kind of way of looking at the treaty ports has lost its spell now, and now people are starting to approach the treaty ports with new, fresh eyes and realizing that we can actually study a lot of things and learn a lot about China and its relation to the world through these treaty ports, because they existed, because they're there, and because we have very, very rich and detailed sources. Now, the following chat panel was about history and memory at the Shanghai American School, where we had 4 alumni of the SES sharing their personal experiences of China during when they lived in China. This, of course, for us who visited China, of my generation, we have visited China in a time of ascent, just like Professor Roy brought up. But you, who are the alumni of the SES, of course, have experienced China both at its very bottom, so to speak, when China was still in a civil war, and of course during Japanese occupation. So therefore, for me as an historian, and also on a personal level, it's interesting to interact and learn about your experiences. But there are also personal dimensions to many of the presentations that touch many of us who've been to China and have a personal relationship to China. I think about family life that was sometimes became more intensive. Many of you who were forced to live away from father, and also intense relationships that were forged, intense friendships that were forged in China. And this is something that anyone who's lived in China can relate to, and these very close personal networks that are shaped. Everyday interactions and photographs, of course, that were documented, and also the sense of being separated from your native country. And me as an expat Swede, I've left most of my adult life abroad in China, Japan, and in Sweden. And you're on one hand experiencing interesting things and meeting interesting people, but also the sense of feeling of missing out on what's going on back home, and perhaps sometimes a sense of loss when you return. There are things that you just don't know because you weren't there when it happened. I'm also reminded of how indebted we are to the work of missionaries that has been a part of this conference, and it never ceases to surprise me the extent to which a lot of sinology are indebted to the work of missionaries. And there's a political scientist that many of you may know, who's Lucian Pai, who died a decade ago, who wrote a number of books that are very compelling on political culture in China, warlords in China. He wrote a psychoanalytic biography of Mao, and they're all very well written, but sometimes there are no footnotes. And as a scholar and as a historian, you shake your head, and where are the sources for this? And on the other hand, what he writes was so compelling, and I couldn't really solve this riddle until I realized that he was born in Fenzhou, in today's Fenyang, Jia Zhangke's hometown, in 1921 in Shanxi province. And of course, having spent your childhood and also returning in the 1940s, there were just things that you just knew. You wouldn't footnote those things if you belong to his generation. And there are a number of other scholars who have contributed in the same way. I also resonate on another point, and that's the missionary angle, which is kind of weird perhaps for myself because I haven't experienced that. But one of the reasons I studied Chinese in the first place is the fact that my grandfather spent a couple of years in India in the 1960s and brought with him a lot of artifacts from India, including a grammar that was donated to him by one of my grandmother's relatives who worked as a missionary in southern India and reportedly translated the New Testament into Tamil. So I grew up in this environment full of Indian artifacts, and eventually my grandfather, with some missionary zeal, asked me to study Sanskrit, and I was kind of, I don't think so. I'm a teenager. Teenagers don't study languages that no one speaks, but Chinese, that was kind of interesting. So he gave me this book that he had acquired in India, and I started to work from there. And this is where I come into the story, which I sort of share with many of you in this room, but I came into Chinese studies as a teenager, as a high school student. who visited China during the Reform era. And I was only slightly older than some of you were when you graduated or entered this school, when we're talking about Ambassador Roy, who was in his 14, 15 years old at the time of the communist takeover. So a lot of my own teenage years are shaped by studying Chinese, and when I think it was Carl Scoville brought up how he looks at Chinese characters to relive and to go back and reconnect with yourself. And this is something I can relate to, looking at Chinese characters, browsing through books, and I'm very particular about the books that I look at because I want them to be the ones that I looked at as a teenager. And of course, the recollections of Shanghai that has been intense change, that when Professor Stapleton brought up Shanghai, that in the early 90s looked very much like the treaty port, and I actually did have a glimpse of that. And I also had the sense of loss of having walked through these streets in the acute awareness that they will be gone, that the old Chinese city will be gone, that the synagogue is going to be gone, all these department stores, all these type of architecture that's no longer valued will be gone, and spent a lot of time photographing and walking around these areas. But of course I didn't experience Shanghai like you did as a treaty port. Which brings me to the keynote address by Ambassador Roy, and brings out the fact that we're all kind of stakeholders in the US-China relationship, whether we're US or Chinese citizens or not, we all are very connected to this relationship, both personally but also often professionally in different ways. And I think Ambassador Roy's remarks brought out very well the fundamental contradiction between a kind of a pre-modern political system or an archaic political system with a modern economy and the problems that produce. And also in the Q&A session, the uncertainty in the age of a new administration, and the sense today that, and this extends beyond Asian relations, the failure of the current administration to listen to experts, to listen to China experts. Not that, of course, China experts or sinologists are a homogeneous crowd. We lean left, we lean right, we are centrist, we are in the humanities and the political and the social sciences. But the failure to listen to people who have experience, expertise, and area knowledge, of course, is a striking thing. And this is, of course, something that is a problem of our age, in the words of a political scientist, the death of expertise. That now we're kind of Googling ourselves to truth. And you sometimes find yourself arguing with someone who thinks they know about China because they use Google Translate. And you shake your hand and you think about your efforts that you made in studying Chinese, and of course all the things that could go wrong with that. We also had input from our graduate students. Some of them are in this room now, and some of them presented earlier today on psychology, on cultural differences and personal experiences. And we talked about barefoot doctors, and again dwelled upon expertise and the kind of the conflicts that you can experience when you possess expertise, but also how do you navigate your own personal commitments. Joseph later in his presentation on photography showcased some of his pedagogical skills as photographs as a mirror to the past, and I just alluded to the fact what a shock for me it was to see these pictures that Joe shared with me from Shanghai 1949, and to see color footage. I mean, you who are alumni of the SAS, of course, can just close your eyes and remember Shanghai back then in color. But for me, who is born in the late 20th century, it's harder. And of course, you have the same shock for me when I see color footage from World War II, and you realize that this actually did happen. These events, they actually did happen, and it smelled and had all these kind of sensory aspects that you sort of read out of these sources. And I think Joe very beautifully demonstrated his teaching abilities, his pedagogical abilities that he has made full use of as my graduate student instructor, and also won him a Rackham Outstanding Graduate Student Instructor Award in 2013. And I remember vividly how Joe would, for instance, show a picture of a school class, not your school class, but a school class in Taiwan. They were all dressed in Japanese school uniforms, and to illustrate the fact that people who are of your generation grew up as Japanese subjects in colonial Japan. And then he points out that one of them is his grandmother. And then you just realize that you know, these kids didn't know that they would grow up to be Chinese. They grew up to think that they were somehow perhaps second-class Japanese citizens, but nevertheless citizens of the Japanese Empire. And that's a thing I can't bring to the classroom because of my my own particular background. We ended up on 3 views of China today with Professor Wang Zhang, Professor Mary Gallagher, and Dr. Wu, that talked about the legacy of the Catholic Church, the legacy of Sikaway, which I already mentioned to you. It's a fantastic, I don't need to tell you this, but those who are graduate students or intending to go to Shanghai, never ever lose an opportunity to go to the Sikaway Library and to use their fabulous resources on China. We talked about socialist feminism and the 3 cohorts that Professor Wang has identified in her recent work. And of course, we also talked about socialist legality, which also is close to my heart as a student of Chinese legal history, and the contradictions of that. And we had a question from the audience, how do you really create rule of law out of a situation when you don't have rule of law? And I can give you an example of this from my own research, which is an introduction to the treaty port system, and someone says that how did Shanghai even work? If you would tell people about Shanghai during, say, 1899, most law professors would shake their heads and say Shanghai is not going to work. You can't have modern commercialism in a place where you have so many overlapping jurisdictions, but yet it did work in its own way. And this was a problem that confronted people way before the reform era. So these are my concluding remarks on my personal and professional experience, reflections on this wonderful conference. And of course, this conference would not have been possible if it had not been for the Lieberthal-Rogel Center for Chinese Studies and our wonderful staff. We have Karol Stepanchuk, who's going to give us sort of wrapping up after me. This would not have been possible without our fantastic staff at the Center for Chinese Institute, the Chinese Studies and the International Institute. And this is a center that goes back to 1961 when it was founded as part of the efforts to explore China. We've been organizing, I spoke to one of the Scoville brothers about the brown bags in Lane Hall back in the day. We've been organizing workshops, talks. We had a book series that now been revived, and have an MA program that has placed people in various graduate programs and positions around the world. And there was a point where a political science program at the University of Michigan was so dominant that people talked about the Michigan Mafia that was led under Kenneth Lieberthal and Michel Oxenberg, that were also part of normalizing relations with the United States, with China. We also, of course, had Harriet Mills that came up in one of the coffee conversations, who was, I believe, alumnus of the SAS. Who also spent some years in captivity in China, which deeply shaped her personal experience. And she was a much beloved teacher of Chinese here at the University of Michigan for several years until her retirement, and was known, I remember from reading some of, I never met her, but apparently she was very, very rigorous and exacting sinologue that would, teach the students Chinese grammar inside and out, and also classical Chinese, I believe she was working on. So she shaped generations of people and connects both this conference and the center. Our center was endowed in 2014 by a donation from Rich Rogel that made it possible for us to launch a postdoctoral program. We're bringing in a cohort of postdoctoral students this year in political science, history, Chinese media and literature, as well as archaeology. We also been able to fund conferences. Those of you who looked at our website noticed that Emily Wilcox of our center, together with Yang Fu in the back, are organizing a dance exhibit and collecting materials on dance. And this has also been funded by the center. Next year, we will move into Denison Hall through a donation of Ron Weiser. And I will have new premises, and I will be able to host visiting scholars as well as postdoctoral students. I really hope that you, if you know of anyone who is interested in studying China, that you bring them to us, and and hopefully tell them good things about our center. I'm going to finish here and give the word to Karl Stepanchuk, who has really been one of the forces behind these conferences and organizing it, and Joe as well. Before I give Carol the mic, I just want to thank all of you who participated in the conference and made this possible. I hope to see you again and hear from you in the future. So, to you all.
Well, Eric has said it all, and I'm really enjoying watching Joseph as videographer, as historian videographer. A thank you to all, and this is really just an echo, just a heartfelt thank you to the speakers, to our organizers, Joseph and Mimi, and to all the participants. It has been such a thrill to be here and be part of this. And I know from previous history conferences that history brings together totally unique individuals. You walk away with memorable experiences and new narratives to retell, and this is no exception. And in my capacity as outreach and community engagement person, if you have any questions about how the Lieberthal-Rogel Center for Chinese Studies supports faculty and student research, by all means contact me, and also for the kind of community engagement that we do. And by the way, your group photo will be in our newsletter, and we will stay connected. We will send you print copies because we have your addresses, and we will have, I'm sure, Joseph, an excellent write-up, and so it will be another marker in this really extraordinary event. So again, this is just a thank you. It has been a total pleasure.
Before you leave, representing the Shanghai American School Association, how can we possibly thank all of you here at the university that have been part of this and have created such a really wonderful experience. I've learned a great deal. It's been a wonderful exchange, and we're just very grateful. This is probably one of the most outstanding reunions that we've had in terms of the content from you organizers, really. And thank you so much, really.